You know, I'm going to repeat that because I'd like this to be recorded and to be able to share with a couple of people who couldn't be on the call. So just very quickly, at a time of growing racial divisions and distrust, can we as reporters produce stories about each other's communities that push beyond negative stereotypes, that help us and our audiences get to know one another? Can we even find stories we could work on together? Ethnic Media Services in California Black Media are dedicating a small grant we won after submitting a proposal to a fund where we laid out a vision for this project. And we got I think of it almost as a small appreciation grant for submitting the proposal. We're dedicating that grant to fellowships for each of you, those of you on today's call who are willing to take on an assignment for this project. In a way, it's a proof of concept. And today is an editorial brainstorm for what we might cover as journalists who can share story ideas, help each other augment ideas, give each other feedback. We're going to start with two colleagues I've known for years who are both veteran journalists and authors, and who can help give us an historical context as well as personal insights into the relationship between Blacks and Chinese Americans. Then we'll go around and ask each of you if you could signify with either your hand or a chat message that you'd like to go next. We'd like to ask you each to share story ideas you want to propose, and we'll try to turn this into a round table. After a brief introduction, because I'd like both our two speakers to know who's on the call, let me just quickly identify all of you so that they know who our roundtable is made up of. And each of you, Alexis, it's true that everybody's now co-hosts so they can speak. Is that correct, Alexis?
Yes, Sandy. So as people are joining, I am making them co-hosts. That is correct.
Okay. So Merdes, you were the first to join. Can you just introduce yourself? Okay, you got to unmute. Alexis, we can't hear Merdes.
You should now. Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
I'm Merdes Hayes from our weekly newspaper in Los Angeles.
Thank
and
you.
We were very pleased to be invited to the Zoom call today with Ethnic Media Services. We receive information from Sandy Close and the organization frequently, and we're always finding it of great use to our readership each week. And I'm happy to be here, and I'd like to listen in on the discussion and possibly come up with some story ideas. You know, in Los Angeles, we have a significant and famous Chinese population, and recently with the recent uptick in violence and hate crimes against the Asian American community, as well as the African American community, I believe that some of the ideas and talk today might be able to touch ground on some of the solutions, not just the causes of it, but maybe some of the solutions whereby we could better forge a more cohesive relationship between these two communities, these two important communities in Los Angeles. And I think this is a very good time to do so.
Well, thank you. You gave my introduction better than I could have. Charles, do you want to just quickly introduce yourself? Charles, if I don't want to lose too much time, so I may Alexis, is Charles unmuted?
I've asked.
No,
to-
he has to unmute himself.
Okay,
Charles?
Yes.
Okay.
Hi.
okay.
Julianne.
can you just quickly introduce yourself?
Who?
Introduce yourself.
Me? Oh, I said myself just now, so I
Okay,
repeat it.
great.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Julian,
Yeah, hello, everybody. It's always good to see all the great colleagues again. I'm Julian Doe, co-director of Ethnic Media Services, and I'm based in Southern California.
great. Han Lee,
Hi, my name is Han. I write for the San Francisco Stampeder as a bilingual reporter. Thanks.
thank you. Khalil,
Hold on. Yes, Khalil Abdullah. I've worked with Sandy at Ethnic Media Services and worked with her from 2006 at
okay,
New American Media.
okay, thank you.
You're
Yuji,
welcome.
okay, Yuji,
Hi everyone, thank you Sandy for inviting me today. I'm Yu Jie Zhou. I'm working for Mission Local in San Francisco. So nice to meet you guys.
thank you. Maggie Zhang,
Hello everyone, I'm Maggie from Singtao Daily, and I'm a Chinese newspaper reporter here in the Bay Area, and I mainly cover the East Bay story. Thank you.
great. Randall, could you introduce yourself? You're muted, but this will make sure everybody is now unmuted so you can participate. Randall,
I'm Randall Yip.
Great.
Yeah, I'm Randall Yip. I'm with the Asian American news site, ASAM News, and also of Asian American Media Inc.
thank you. And Shania Zhang, did we get you or not? Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, hi. Hi, I'm Sheena Zhang, and I'm news reporter from Skylink TV in San Francisco. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. And Jean, you've already introduced yourself from the wilderness. Thank you for joining my phone. Sunita.
All right.
Sunita.
Hi, I'm Sunita Sarabji. I think you all know me from the Friday briefings. I've been working with Sandy since 2020. Happy to be here.
Paulette, thank you for joining us.
Paulette Brown-Hines, thank you for the invitation, Sandy. Publisher of the Black Voice News in Riverside, California.
Terrific. Wrong, I know you are on a tight timeline. Thank you for joining us from New York.
Hi, I'm Rong Xiaoqing. I work for the Chinese language Singtao Daily. I also write for Chinese language newsletter for the New York Times called Overseas Chinese Journal.
Thank you. Marita, thank you for joining us. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. Marita Cubanez with Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. I'm subbing in for my colleague, Michelle Boykins, who I believe will be joining shortly.
Thank you. Malcolm, can you join us?
I'm here, Sandy. Malcolm Marshall, publisher of Richmond Pulse newspaper here in Richmond, California. Great to be here.
Thank you. Henrietta, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks so much, Sandy. I'm the founder of the East Palo Alto Today newspaper that comes out of East Palo Alto, California, and I'm the host of the Talking with Henrietta show. I saw the invitation today in my email, and of course, I had a lot of other things to do this afternoon, but this is such an important subject that I decided not to miss this. And of course, if Sandy's involved in it, then it's worth attending. Thank you.
Thank you. But Stephanie Williams. Stephanie, you're on mute. Stephanie, can you introduce yourself again? Great.
I'm Stephanie Williams with the Black Voice News in Riverside, and I'm excited about this project and happy to meet everyone. Thank you, Sandy.
Thank you so much. And Charlene Mohammed, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, Charlene Mohammed, In the Works Media Consultants.
Great. Okay, we are ready now, and let me introduce our honored speakers. We are going to start with Helen Zia, whom I know many of us already know, a Chinese American journalist, author, and activist for Asian American and LGBTQ rights, and a key figure, a longtime figure in the Asian American movement, author of, Helen, is it 5 books now, including Asian American Dreams, the amazing story on Wen-Oh Lee, so many books. Anyway, thank you for joining us. And our second speaker is Paula Williams Madison, an American journalist, writer, business person, executive, former NBC Universal executive, and chairwoman and CEO of Madison Media Management, LLC. Her book, Finding Samuel Lowe, China, Jamaica, Harlem, is a biography of her grandfather, who was Chinese. So we have a remarkable 2 people to start off our conversation. And Helen, would you do us the favor of going first, giving us an overview of the relationship between Blacks and Chinese Americans?
Well, thank you, Sandy, and thanks to all of you for taking the time out of your busy days for this discussion. Like all of you, if Sandy calls and says this is an important discussion, I felt the same, to have to be here. And it's an honor to be here as well with Paula Madison, who is a dear friend of mine from long ago, our active journalism days, and we are actually working together on a project about civil rights and multiracial unity. And so 10 minutes is a short time. I just want to run through some things. You know, I grew up at a time in the 1950s and 1960s, seems like ancient history now, but I'm a daughter of Chinese immigrants. My parents did not speak Chinese to us because they were afraid we would experience more discrimination and racism. So I grew up without being able to speak Chinese. And of course, that separated me from the larger Chinese community. But at the time in New Jersey, there were so few Asian Americans of any kind, let alone Chinese. And unless you actually lived in a ghetto like a Chinatown or a Little Manila or a Japantown or Little India or other ethnic enclave of Asians, you really were one in a bazillion. And whenever my family walked into a shop or diner, everybody in the place turned their head to look at us as though we were aliens, not aliens by citizenship, but aliens from Mars. And so I was very fortunate at the time to grow up when there was a civil rights movement going on. And I grew up watching the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and hearing about Rosa Parks and seeing what would happen to people who stood up just to be treated as full human beings. And growing up in New Jersey outside of a two military bases, many of my friends and kids in school were the children of military families whose fathers or brothers were fighting in Vietnam. And people would routinely say when they saw me or my brothers or family, "Oh, they're everywhere, aren't they?" And it was very clear that they were referring to people who on TV were being killed by the thousands every day by count. So that was the time I grew up. And when I even was in high school and going to college, I wanted to be part of those civil rights movements because I completely identified with the idea that people should be able to be full human beings. And I wasn't alone. So when I went to college, it was a time where there were, I was an affirmative action baby, where when I went to school, there were so few people of color, so few Black, brown, yellow, red students in college, and so few women that we hung out together. We stood together, we fought in unity together to try to achieve something that we felt that people of color, and we called ourselves Third World. You know, some of you are from the Bay Area. There was a Third World strike that was students of color standing together. And so that's part of a near history that unfortunately, I think where we are today is where between that time, and I put a timestamp on it. I mean, there are a few events that I want to point to in the near recent history that I think have driven our communities apart deliberately. And by deliberately, there are think tanks that are financed by billions of dollars, completely aimed at dividing our communities, Black, Asian, as well as just all of the communities. And with the idea that if we are united, we can't be defeated. And if we are divided, then anything can happen, including a takeover of Congress. So I just with that, there are a couple of historical moments I want to point to. And because I see a true shift that took place. When I was in high school and the civil rights movement was in full bloom, there was an article that came out in the Sunday New York Times and also by the same author in US News and World Report that came out in 1966. And up until then, I'm sure all of you know that there was exclusion acts, not just one, but first beginning to eliminate all Chinese out of America. Then that was extended to eliminate all Asians from ever becoming American participants in this democracy, from being able to immigrate or become citizens. And those didn't end until 1952. And so then there was the internment of Japanese Americans. All 120,000 Japanese Americans who lived on the West Coast were put into American concentration camps. And that was the prelude to basically how Asians were seen in America until 1966. And those two articles came out and basically said, at a time when America is awash in worry over the plight of minorities, there is one group that is advancing by dint of their own hard work, not a welfare check. And those are the Asian Americans. Now you can look up those articles, they exist. It was after more than 100 years of being the alien that I grew up being seen as. Suddenly there was this new thing in 1966. And what was happening in 1966? It was the civil rights movement. And so suddenly this idea that Asians were somehow the good minority, the better minority, better than what? Clearly they were referring to Black people and the civil rights movement. And that was what was the beginning of a wedge. And using Asian American, these were not written by Asians. Asians were used to being put in concentration camps and being excluded and ethnically cleansed and massacred and lynched. And that was our history too. And then in 1966, that changed. And then that projectile continued. Meanwhile, I was a teenager joining with other people of color to stand together. And so there were many incidents like that. So I ended up in Detroit in the 1970s. Why? Because friends of mine said, if you really want to make social change in America, you should go to the heartland of America. So I went to Detroit, which was even then a majority Black city, 60 to 70% then. And I got a job in an auto factory. Most of my coworkers most were Black. Some were Arab American. There's a large Arab community in Michigan, and others were white. There were very, very few other Asians. And what was I doing? Organizing was standing about fighting apartheid, going to union meetings, handing out flyers to say apartheid must end and these companies have to divest. So I just want to say this to say I wasn't alone. There were many, many young Asian American activists at that time who came out of that third world period of wanting to stand up and fight for the full equality of all people. And so then that shifted with that model minority, those model minority articles that came out, that became and slowly have become the dominant narrative in America, to distrust Asians because we are interlopers, because we are here to stand on the backs of Black people, of brown people, and to basically, like the alien, to take over America. And we know there's a China initiative now that says that every Chinese waiter is a potential spy for China. So these narratives have kind of come together, but mostly to serve to divide us. And so there's so much to say, but because of this narrative, I think we know where we are today, where videos go viral that show Black people who have attacked Asian people, even though studies have shown that the vast majority of these anti-Asian attacks have been by white men. Incidents, studies show this, but those go viral and only further add to the anti-Blackness within the Asian community, and then the anti-Asianness within the Black community. And so we're at a time where our communities are further being, having these harmful, hateful stereotypes reinforced upon us. The affirmative action debate that is going to the Supreme Court today, that was set in motion by white conservatives who have then found that they could get Asian communities, who are, in my opinion, misguided, to join with them. And so I just want to show two slides that I'm not going to talk a lot about, but I just want to show them. So let me see, I've got to go to share screen here. And is my screen being shared? Yeah, so here is what I want to show you. From the current slide, this is a picture of two individuals from the 1800s. The one on the right is Frederick Douglass, one of the leading spokespeople of America, really, of the 1800s, talking about equality, fighting against slavery, talking about freedom and abolitionists. But who is this guy on his left? This is Wong Kim Ark. This is the man who is responsible for all Americans of immigrant or refugee stock to be able to be considered American citizens, birthright citizenship. He fought for that all the way to the Supreme Court. It went there in 1898. And why is Frederick Douglass here next to him? Because Frederick Douglass stood up for the rights of Chinese to be not excluded in America. He stood up using his, pulpit to say that the Chinese Exclusion Act is wrong. And I just want to point this out because this whole period we're in is to suggest that Asians and Blacks have no history together, that, that we did not walk on a common ground together and can't be together. And this is like, 150 years ago. And then just one other slide, a little more recent history. This is one of the marches across the Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. And when I was fighting for the civil rights of Vincent Chin in Detroit, in a Black city, and I would go on talk radio and people would call in and say, where are you? Where did you Asians come from? Are you just here to ride on the coattails of the Black civil rights movement? And that was a completely legitimate question, because to the media, Asian Americans have been so completely invisible that they wouldn't know that this march across the Pettus Bridge, what is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and the first row, and John Lewis is in there. What were they wearing? They're wearing leis from Hawaii. People came all the way from Hawaii, Asian Americans, Chinese Americans, Hawaiian, Native Hawaiians, and besides them from Hawaii, there were other Asians who also joined in. And there's a sign that they brought that said, Hawaii knows integration works. So I just want to give these pictures.
Show the second slide, Helen. There it is. Okay.
Did it not show up?
No, it now is. Now it is.
Oh, well, I was talking about this slide. I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. We remember
anyway,
what you said. It's
so
very powerful.
This slide, But so this is the first row of the march with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, John Lewis, and they're wearing the lace from Hawaii. And so I won't repeat all that, but the idea that Asian, yellow and black and brown people could not be together today couldn't be more wrong, because we have been. We have a history together, and the history has what I call missing in history. So I just wanted to show those slides to say that we have to have, as we report on these things, even in our vision, to be able to visualize that actually Asian and Black people have been together before, but we are caught, I think, at the bottom of a pendulum swing that has deliberately been trying to divide and give misinformation and disinformation about our communities. And we don't have to go that far back. You know, there are actually many examples, if we look hard enough, you know, that don't get elevated, and certainly don't get elevated in the mainstream media, you know, that we can actually find where our communities are next door to each other, where there are people who know and support each other. And so I just want to, I've gone over, I'm terribly sorry, but this is just the image I want to leave behind. Because, and why is it so dangerous to show our communities together? Because if you took, and demographically, the numbers are going up, right? If you took Black, brown, yellow, red communities, and so people of color and people of conscience together today, we are the majority. And if we could really harness the solidarity that has happened in the past and does exist, then, you know, we could beat back this stuff, because the fear of us joining together is what is driving the Make America White Again movement. So I just want to stop there.
Helen, those slides are just extraordinary. Could you share them? Could we share them either on, I can send them to everybody after the call.
I will send those to you, Sandy.
Okay, those are a picture. I don't want to say in this case it's worth 1,000 words, but a picture amplifies your eloquent presentation. Now let's go to Paula Madison. Thank you, Paula, for joining us.
Thank you, Sandy. It has been years since you and I have interacted on such a level, but I'm like everyone else. If Sandy summons you, you show up. I also have a picture that I'd like to show, but I'm going old school, because in this case, I do think a picture would sort of summarize what I'm about to talk about. So this is a copy of my book, Finding Samuel Lowe, China, Jamaica, Harlem. But importantly, this is a picture of my mother, if you can see it. So that's my mother. This is me. My mother's father traveled from what would be present-day Shenzhen, China, in Guangdong province, southern China, to Jamaica in 1905 when he was 15 years old. Unlike many of the other Chinese men who immigrated, he was not old enough to be married. So many of the other men already had families and children who they would have been leaving behind. And therefore that was an anchor to get them to return to China. As I said, my grandfather was 15, not into his adult manhood yet. So he had no wife, no children. And when he got to Jamaica, he came into his adulthood there. And while there, he had 2 local women as partners, both of them African Jamaicans, one of whom was my grandmother. And together they had my mother, their only child. And then there was another African Jamaican woman, and they had 2 children who survived to adulthood, one who died at the age of 6. I'm bringing that up because many of you might not have heard of this newly coined description, but some of you might have, and it's called Blasian, right? Black Asians. And the thought for many is that that mixture of African and Asian people largely came about as a result of US soldiers going into Asian territories and fathering children. And by the way, can I just ask for all the people, if you have the opportunity to turn your camera on, I'd appreciate you turning your camera on, unless of course you're eating or just don't want to be seen. But it's I think for me a more enriching experience to be able to see the actual people. So in this case, my grandfather had two Jamaican women who were his partners. There came a point when he was in his mid to late 20s where his family in China decided that he needed to have a Chinese wife to fulfill what Chinese families want, you know, a continuation of the legacy of the line, children, etc. And so they sent to my grandfather a Chinese woman for him to marry, sight unseen. She traveled to Jamaica in 1920, accompanied by her father. And on the ship's manifest, which I have seen, she's listed as his wife. Why? Because even then, Chinese were not allowed to travel into many nations with women. There was no desire for Chinese to have families. They were to come, perform the labor, and then from there, presumably go back home. What did happen throughout much of the Caribbean and parts of Latin America was that these men came, they frequently worked sugar plantations. My grandfather in 1905 went to work in an establishment, a grocery, which back then colloquially was called in Jamaica a Chinese shop. We would call it a bodega, a grocery store. It was called a Chinese shop. So these men sometimes would come, they'd work on the plantations, replacing formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants, who at points refused to work for the sugar plantations because of the horrendous history involved and the murder and the subjugation and the enslavement. So they were like, no, we're not working for you. A call went out overwhelmingly from England and the United States to China and to India, seeking the cheapest labor that they could attract. And that labor overwhelmingly, men from China, men from India, not allowed to travel with their families and certainly not allowed to travel with women. And for the few women who would be on these ships, they were sometimes brought in as sex workers, not for the Chinese and Indians, but for the British who were involved in this transportation during, whether it was during the slave trade or post-slave trade. It would have been moving people from South and Eastern Asia into Trinidad, Jamaica, Panama, Honduras, you name it. Even many of them today, as you all might know, are in Peru, Brazil, a number of other places. That went on that way for quite some time. My mother was born in 1918. And about 7 or 8 years ago, I had someone ask me, how could your mother have been born in 1918? Which I thought was a weird question. I said, why do you ask? Well, because that didn't really happen until wartime. No, that really happened once Chinese men began coming into the United States in the 1800s. They were forbidden, as I said, from having their own families and women. And there is a history, particularly in the state of California, where there were more than 200 villages and towns that were peopled by Chinese who would have had children with local women being indigenous women, Mexican women, and African-American women. On the few occasions when they had sexual relations with white women, and it didn't happen often, but when it did happen, there was lynching. they would lynch the Chinese men to teach them a lesson. It didn't take a lot to teach them those women were off limits. But there is a history of mixed race Chinese relations back to the 1800s, particularly in the state of California. Now, I say all this just so you have some grounding. My mother immigrated to the United States in 1945. She wasn't able to secure her birth certificate because her mother, African Jamaican, discarded her. And my mother wanted to escape Jamaica, where she had been brutalized by her grandmother, an African Jamaican, and pretty much rejected community-wise by Blacks. There were some Chinese, I should say here, that my family is Hakka. So Hakka, the estimates are there are 80 million Hakka people on the planet. The huge majority of them live in China. Racially, they are similar to 90+% of the Chinese. Hakka is a cultural minority, not a racial minority. So my grandfather was not, as one white woman once asked me, I don't understand, are you saying that your grandfather moved from Africa to China and that's how he's Chinese? No, I'm saying that my grandfather was Chinese and had sex, and hopefully enjoyable and frequent sex, with an African Jamaican woman, and my mother was produced as a result of that. I should say that about 5 minutes later, after the audience kind of snickered and the woman's face was red, she got up and left. But for some people, it is so unfathomable that that kind of a relation could exist between Chinese and Black women who, if you guys pay any attention to pop culture, you would have heard that based on the scale of who one finds romantic. Who does one find romantic to date? At the bottom of the list in the United States, and this pop quiz this thing was done maybe 10, 15 years ago, at the bottom were African-American women and Asian men. Not romantic, not interested, right? So the concept that this Chinese man could have had relations with African Jamaican women, and by the way, my grandfather was not the only one. I will tell you that the island of Cuba today, and I have visited Cuba on a few occasions, 20% of Cuba's population is mixed race Chinese. That doesn't mean one man was running around having sex. No, a significant percentage of Cuba's population, 1 in 5, mixed race Chinese. Pick Panama, the nation of Panama, which I will say in some instances would be considered a way station or a crossroads, kind of like Grand Central Station. You go there, you get off one boat and catch another boat to another place. Some of the people who arrived didn't have the proper credentials. So you have a huge number of Chinese descendants living in Panama. People, well, how did that happen? Because they came from wherever they came and were on their way to wherever the next place was, and they didn't have the proper documents or they didn't have the money, and so they stayed in Panama. My mother came to the United States in 1945 from Jamaica, holding a British passport. My mother's British passport identified her as a citizen of the British Empire. She came here strangely under the Chinese immigration quota. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the Chinese immigration quota, you heard Helen talk about the Chinese Exclusion Acts. Those acts were instituted beginning in 1882, and they didn't really end until around 1944, 1945. And why did they end? Those acts prevented Chinese from owning land, from being citizens, from having access to public schools, the right to vote. They had no rights. They could pay taxes, but they didn't have any other citizen-like rights. I was talking to my grandson the other day, and I said to him, because I'm I frequently, in many ways, am intent on my grandson understanding the true history of the world, not the history of the world taught in his history books in school, which are full of lies. By the way, I was a history major in college and an Africana Studies major with a concentration in Caribbean and Asian studies. I said to him, what happened that got the United States into the war? He said, well, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Okay, and how did the United States retaliate, I asked him. He said, oh, they dropped Big Boy and Little Boy. Do you know that that would have been a suicide mission, but for the fact that the United States became allies with China? What do you mean, Grandma? Okay. The reason why Pearl Harbor was bombed was because it was a United States outpost in the Pacific. In order for the United States to retaliate against Japan, they had to refuel, or else it's a one-way trip. It's a suicide mission. They got into an alliance with China, who has always been hated. The Chinese are the only citizens of a nation who were not allowed to seek citizenship in the United States. You got to understand that. As African diasporic people, we were brought here against our wills, but there came a point when we were granted citizenship. Okay. It didn't happen with Chinese. It happened for Chinese when the United States formed this alliance with China. China was able to, the United States was able to bomb Japan and then go to China to refuel. That's how and why the United States and China became allies during World War II. At which point the president of the United States said, they're allies. Maybe we should do something a little more. So the little more that they did was they passed what's known as the Chinese immigration quota. 105 Chinese citizens were granted visas into the United States annually. My grandson said, wait, what? Per year, 105, I could fit 105 people in my office annually. And I said to my grandson, Idris, understand, Chinese were never wanted here. And even when China became an ally of the United States, not wanted here. So my mother, I don't know how, I do not understand how. My mother's father, Chinese citizen, she's holding a British passport. My mother looked Chinese, was granted admission under the Chinese immigration quota. How is that possible? I contend that it's because the United States did not really want Chinese. They wanted kind of Chinese, people who could speak English, people who were not going to be mysterious and scary. But all of that notwithstanding, my mother married an African Jamaican man who followed her from Jamaica to the United States, and they married in Harlem. My mother went to Harlem because her mother's relatives were in Harlem and had bought up some property. They agreed to sponsor my mother, who did not look Black. My father traveled here to chase her down. He was a stowaway. His father had money, but Jamaicans were not allowed into the United States. Why? Because Marcus Garvey formed and created the United Negro Improvement Association, and the United States immigration policy focused on Jamaicans who were seen as troublesome. Think back to the Harlem Renaissance and the numbers of Jamaicans and Caribbeans who actually were the standout stars of the Harlem Renaissance. Why? Because even in Jamaica, under a British system, they were largely getting a better education in terms of the classics, et cetera, than African Americans were getting here in the United States. So my mother and my father come together. My brothers and I are born. My father and my mother break up, and there is my mother living in Harlem, raising 3 Black children looking Chinese in an entirely Black neighborhood. I learned early on about race and racism from both sides.
Paula, this is an extraordinary call to action for your book. And I am going to send actually everybody on this call one of Helen's books and Paula's books, because historically, even though I lived much of the experience Helen talked about, this is so rich a context for us now to zero in on what do we do to tell each other's stories more effectively, so that, as Helen says, the wedge that grew up to divide Black from Asian, Black from Chinese, and the stereotypes, the negative stereotypes that, as you say, Paula, have been just so embedded in the history of the country. Can we as media serving our own communities, can we develop a editorial mission almost to see how to cover each other's communities in a way that get at the historic and contemporary common ground that honestly is what I'd like to now turn to our media colleagues to share initial story ideas, and want to invite both Helen and Paula to comment or elaborate or ask questions. And
Sandy, can I just offer one story idea that I think is important? Yeah. I used to be vice president of the Los Angeles Police Commission, and I saw myself as an undercover agent. When the mayor asked me to join the police commission, I kept asking him, "Are you sure? Are you sure you really want me?" I asked him, I said, "You know that I was once a member of the Nation of Islam, right?" He said, "Yes." I said, "You know that I have a long and storied history as a journalist, right?" He said, "Yes, but that would make you perfect." Well, let me tell you how it ended up not being perfect for him. And that'll be another story. But one of the things that I did ask the present police chief, the police chief reports to the 5-member police commission. I was not asked to serve another term by the mayor, by the way. When the attacks on Asians occurred with some frequency, I have a little group of civic leaders who are Asian American, Latino, and African American, and we convene weekly by Zoom, and our collective age is probably 10,000 years. But we're community leaders here in Los Angeles. And we went to the police chief and asked 2 things. One, given these attacks, can you please authorize your police officers to hand out, and this is not what it is, but let's say it's a card this size, a card in 7 Asian languages, which when people say to the police, somebody just attacked me, or somebody called me a name, or somebody hit me with a stick, if that person is of the Asian community, please find out which is their primary language and hand them this card, not this card, but it gives them resources for who to turn to, legal resources, social resources, housing resources, all kinds of stuff. And so the chief said, yes, they paid for it. The police officers are handing out these cards. The second thing we asked for was, could you please have the police department hold roll call publicly every morning in Chinatown? Meaning that when you see on television, the sergeant telling the officers, here's what's going on today, here it's happening in Chinatown. There are scores of police officers gathering on the street in Chinatown because we asked for a very visual demonstration of police presence as a protection Now, certainly we have the people who are walking the elders where they want to go, but a story idea, and I will say, you know, this is vis-a-vis what I believe is going on in Northern California. The police chief in in San Francisco is my friend. He used to be a deputy chief here. And I know there are people who won't cooperate, won't talk to him or whatever at all. But I saw it as important in order to further the protection of the Chinese community, of the Asian American community, and also to drive a wedge in that story that it's mostly African Americans who are attacking Asian Americans. The people who are mostly attacking, as Helen said, are white men. Something on the order of 67%. There was a study. But the 67% of white men are frequently not homeless, and they're frequently not African American. African Americans and mentally ill are overrepresented in the homeless population. And where that meets is where video is captured of somebody who might be homeless, African American, and mentally ill attacking, because the slick white guys are not doing it where anybody's got a camera. And news media, journalists, particularly the television journalists, take good video. We got a shot of a woman hitting somebody over the head with a hammer. We got a shot of a Black person pushing an Asian American on the tracks. It gets played and replayed and replayed, and it is leaving an incorrect impression of who's committing these acts. I'll shut up now.
Ooh, Sandy, can I just say something? Because she just touched my whole heart.
Okay, sure.
And I'm so sorry that I just came in, but you touched my whole heart, Miss Madison, because.
Just call me Paula, please.
Okay. It's hard. My mom, you know, I was raised by a mom who was like, you better put a handle on it, girl. So, you know, Sandy this last week had me go to the Battery to go speak about this. And I was grappling with it because I've been following it, but not following it fully. The API hate against Black folks. I mean, against Black folks and API folks. And I just wanted to say what you just said, I wish I would have been able to articulate the same way. Because Sandy, this is what I was saying in our own newsroom. One of our reporters, I think she left because after in Oakland, whenever they kept showing the two Black men that had pushed down two elders, in Oakland, the media kept playing that over and over and over again. And then there became a narrative that Trump inspired these Black people to do it. And I said, I'm sorry, that is not true. I said, maybe I wasn't invited to the cookout that they decided that was going to happen, but that is not true. So you are so right that the mainstream media captures these things and they replay it over and over and over again, which is what Sandy talks about. This deepens the stereotype and creates the fear that and paints the image that Black men are going to be violent towards Asian people, elders, women, or what have you. So one of the things that I did this week, my mom who's on this call, she served in the state assembly, and I reached out because one of my Facebook friends is her old seatmate, Miss Yamada. She served in the state assembly, and so she was talking about the Japanese internment camp, and so I asked her, you know what, I want to see if we can do a collaboration, and maybe it's around May. I was looking for the next hike date around what you were talking about, the Japanese internment camp, and looking at how we tie it in some way to doing an op-ed that we share with all of the Black press, looking at how they put notice up. And I was like, man, that's kind of like Juneteenth, because she was saying they were told that they had to go into camps, but they didn't learn about, I think that was in February, but they didn't put notice up into people's communities until May. And then so I was looking at this, we still don't know how we're going to work it out, but one of those things that we're trying to do is take these opportunities to be able to tell these stories, each other's stories, as well as, I mean, I really would love for anybody to want to collaborate next year for Lunar New Year. I don't know if it's still appropriate to do it now or not, but I would love to collaborate where we have, you know, our API community talk about the Lunar New Year. My ignorance, because I was living in Sacramento, thought that basically Lunar New Year was Chinese Lunar New Year, because I was around so many people who were Chinese that that's what they called it. And whenever my son, I do the newsletter for my son's classroom, And I said, hey, we could put a message in there about Chinese New Year. And she said, the teacher corrected me and said, you should be doing it on Lunar New Year. But just knowing those little things to create that inclusion, I think all of our publishers would welcome it on that side, and being able to tie in our things that are very important to our community, being able to work collaboratively, I think would be super important.
Thanks, Regina. I'm going to ask Rong Xiaoqing, who's been covering the reactions of Chinese in New York to the 2 recent murders of Chinese women. And we've talked about possible ideas that can shift the lens to more of a human storytelling, something that will also take us, widen the lens away from the negative stereotypes. Rong, do you want to share your story idea?
Sure. First of all, I want to thank Paula and Helen for your presentations. Although I know some of the history stuff, but when you told your stories, it's still very impressed. And also, I think it is true that either both ethnic media, Chinese language media, and the mainstream media, we don't have enough of this kind of history talk. Stories focusing on how Chinese and the Black communities work together in the past. This is a huge vacuum in our newspaper, in our coverage. But I want to say that I particularly want to highlight the new immigrants from mainland China among our readers. This is a group that in the recent years were more and more leaning to the right. So it's not easy to convey such a message to them. You see in the local elections in New York, as well as the recent San Francisco Education Board election, you see this group of people are they're using their ballots to get what they want. I can understand this group of people when they're facing public safety crisis, and when they're facing the admission problems that they feel like it's not unfair to them, especially the affirmative action, and they would like to find a target to vent their anger. So I think in this situation, we're facing a very tough situation to call people to build solidarity. I think one way we all need to think as journalists is, how do we tell the story? How do we send out the messages? I think for this group of people, the traditional way of sending out messages, just as simply calling for solidarity, just as simply telling them about the histories, it's not going to work very well. Because the history is not their history. They grew up in mainland China, so they feel that's a distant to them. But what I found a wonderful example, I told Sandy once, was last May when Al Sharpton came to Chinatown. He built a stage in the middle of Chinatown, in the heart of Chinatown. Not only him, some other community leaders, Black community leaders, Black religious leaders as well. But Al Sharpton said something that was so impressive. He said, well, during the recent anti-Asian hate crimes, I know like some people from our community, from the Black community, became the perpetrators. And I'm here to tell you guys that they don't represent our communities. They are the coward. We are here to stand with you. And then after that, he started to tell a story about the geese formation. He said the geese, when they fly, they form some formation, and they always have a leading goose who would take all the weather's torture until he couldn't sustain anymore. And he would go to the end of the formation. Another geese will come to the position to lead the whole team. And Al Sharpton said, we people in color, minority people, no matter you're Chinese, Black, or Hispanic, we take the turn to lead this formation. Sometimes it's Black people, sometimes it's Asian people who stand in the front and take all the harsh situations. But no matter what, we all belong to the same formation. I think message like that, delivering in this way, would be easier to send out, to be accepted by the new immigrants. So that's all I want to say, that we need to think about the way we send out the messages.
Hello, Murtis Hayes here, and I'm listening here, and I've just heard just a number of interesting and fact-filled comments regarding the relationship between the Black and Asian community. And I'm reminded of the election of Tom Bradley. In 1973, there was a strong coalition built by Bradley of Black people, of course, from South LA, Latinos from East LA, whites and Jewish persons from West LA, but most certainly a strong relationship and cohesive coalition between the Black community and the Asian community, Asian American community, that helped to lift Tom Bradley to 4 terms as LA mayor. And one man in particular who benefited greatly was Mike Wu. Some of you may know who Mike Wu was. He was one of the first Asian Americans to be elected to city council. I worked with his sister down the Times. And Mike Wu was very popular in the Black community. And he ran for mayor, and he did quite well. I believe he lost to old Dick Reardon at that time. But this was around the time, just after the Rodney King riots. And there was a strong relationship, a building, a forging relationship between the Black and Asian communities. And it's odd, you don't want to go back to something as rudimentary as television or entertainment, but for so long, the image of the Black person and the image of the Asian person were the houseboy, the Hop Sing from Bonanza, or Hey Boy from Have Gun Will Travel, or Sammy Tong from Bachelor Father, and so on. Those images began to change, I think, with the advent of George Takei in Star Trek. That was the first time that you would see a dignified and a strong Asian character. And we would see that more so as time went on. But as Helen had mentioned, there has been a strong effort to divide the relationship and a strong bond between the Black and Asian communities, particularly in some of the larger cities like LA, particularly on the West Coast, San Francisco, LA, San Diego, and so on, and even in New York. And I think that forums like this can only help to remind people that in many ways we are brothers and sisters in arms, and there is a concerted effort, I believe, to try to divide these two strong and vibrant communities, specifically politically. The Asian community came out very, very strong for Joe Biden, as did the Black community. And now you see so many people trying to divide and conquer. And in order to put a more conservative spin into politics. And I've always wondered, we're looking towards a Black woman for the Supreme Court. We've had plenty of Catholics on the Supreme Court. We have a Latina on the Supreme Court, a Jewish woman on the Supreme Court. When will we have an Asian person on the United States Supreme Court? I think that's just the most logical step. I would hope that they're liberal Democrat, but I think it's time that we at least recognize the contributions and the long-held faith that our Asian brethren have in this country. And I guess you can go all the way back to the Chinese Exclusion Act. And here in Los Angeles, there has been a bit of strife, I guess, during World War II, when unfortunately the Japanese persons were relocated into concentration camps, relocation camps, they called them, for Black people moved into Little Tokyo
So,
and into Chinatown and so on temporarily until these people, they weren't even allowed to even own their own property, the Chinese and Japanese people. But we would manage to forge strong and lasting and beneficial relationships since then. And I think it's just a shame that there are some people who are trying to tear that down. So I've got an idea for a story, just what I spoke of about, the bond that was forged by Tom Bradley between the Black and Asian communities. And let's hope that that can be restored somehow sometime in the near future.
well, I think your idea of an editorial calling, I mean, imagine the power of the Black press calling for the next nominee after the current one to be an Asian representative.
Well, we've never had one, and I believe it's about time.
But let me ask for very concrete story ideas. One of the ones Ron gave me, and that goes very much along with Paula's remarkable history, is to tell the story of a Chinese Black family, a family that has been made up of a Black father, an Asian woman, an Asian mother, or vice versa. I think, very little was said on the census data about the rise of inter-ethnic marriage. There tends to be a focus on whites marrying non-whites, but the whole evolution of interracial marriage, I remember a Yo kid referring to herself as Blaxican. That was in the 80s or 90s. But that story of a mixed racial marriage is a human story of a Chinese restaurant in Hunters Point whose clientele is primarily Black, and the relationship of the chef to the customers. And there's stories about common ground in the culture that we could be telling that would be a counter narrative. I would love to know if people have ideas along those lines.
I kind of have one. Hello, my name is Dennis Perez Bravo.
Dennis.
Hello. I work with the Richmond Pulse here in Richmond, California. And well, here in Richmond, displaced Asian Americans, they have a long history. Asian Americans and African and Black and other Black and Brown communities have built like coalitions, spaces, and organizations that are surrounding environmental justice. We have a lot of Japanese and Laotian kept gardens throughout low-income communities. And, I'm pretty sure if we go and, look for that history, there is, Black and Asian communities that have helped each other, keep these farms and gardens going.
That's great. That's a great story idea.
Right now in Richmond, Urban Tilth, they have a North Richmond farm. And so there's a historic Japanese greenhouse that is right next to it. And there's a developer who's trying to create, develop something, and it'll cut, basically the building will cut sun time away from the garden. And so that's like a news hook, but what the story would entail would be, how that culture of, the land of planting, of eating the food that you grow, that culture, of nature, and, just having that, what, Asian Americans and Black communities share together, just that utilizing that native land. And so, and why it's been such a important task for them to continue on through generations here in Richmond, and Black and Brown people have been, leading that, including Asian Americans. And so,
That's a great idea. In the interest of time, because I'm anxious to tap as many people as possible, let me call on Charles Ding, who's always come up with wonderful story ideas over a long period of time. Charles, do you have any possible stories you can think of doing in Los Angeles that show common ground between Black and Chinese communities?
Oh, I don't have a specific ideas, but in my experience in the last 2 years, the Chinese community may be some misunderstanding African American community, especially two things. One is after COVID breaking, some Asians and especially Chinese were attacked by the African suspects in the streets or in the train. We showed the video on the TV or website. Yeah, it's impressed to us. The other is regarding the Proposition 16. You may know this one. It's about required California University admission students not based on the merit, based on the diversity, ethnic background. So this seems not good feeling to the Asian American, especially Chinese community. So those
are very, very much at the heart of this distrust. Helen, do you have any thoughts or recommendations for Charles, who's with the World Journal?
Yeah, you know, those are a dominant narrative, and I think who is it? Rong Xiaoqing was talking about you know, how there are so many more conservative of the newer immigrants, and unfortunately a lot of the channels that they use are WeChat, which are, you know, in Chinese language, that has been taken over in many ways by far right. And so how do we counter that? I mean, I think for reporters, it's to find the individuals who actually are doing things that are not, you know, that are not in support, for example, of the affirmative action case that are going forward. There are many, many, many Asians who have stood up. You know, the case that went before Harvard, there was a whole group of people in, you know, Boston and Cambridge called Asian Americans for Affirmative Action. Of course, they get no attention at all in the mainstream media. The other speaker mentioned the Reverend Al Sharpton. Well, you know, we can highlight and lift up people like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Stacey Abrams, Mayor Lance Bottoms, Jesse Jackson. These are all prominent African Americans, Black people, who have stood up and said the violence against Asian Americans is wrong. And so I think in, you know, the World Journal or other Asian community papers, and even in Black community papers, to elevate those individuals and interview them and ask them, so why do you say this? Where do you see, as a leader, you know, of many communities, where policies could change, where you know, where things are happening in Atlanta, for example, that are bringing communities together. And we know that Georgia was a swing state where actually the coalition, you know, standing behind Reverend Warnock and the elections, senatorial elections there, strongly had Asian, Black, and, you know, progressive people in the state of Georgia, but there was really a strong coalition. So it's not ancient history. This is going on. So I would just suggest finding people who are doing that work. Within the Asian community, I mean, I live in the East Bay, and I noticed a number of the Chinese language reporters, you know, are covering the Bay Area and even the East Bay. There are a lot of community leaders who are standing up and saying, you know, this focus on Black people as harm to Asian people is wrong, and really trying to find ways of restorative justice and things like that. And there are individuals, like Eddie Zheng and Susanna Yi, and people who have periodically been in the news, but really are working very hard. Alex Tom, who brought together the Asian and Black communities in the Bayview Hunters Point area, and actually brought communities together to have, food and sit down together, even though there was a lot of distrust, but over food and breaking bread together to kind of talk to each other. So those are things that are going on. And I just think, finding those voices and having them, really lifting them up, because they don't get attention in the mainstream,
Thank you. I'm going to go Stephanie Williams. You have your hand up. Great. Stephanie from Black Voice News.
Thank you, Sandy. I had a couple of ideas, beginning with this nation's continuous failure to pass anti-lynching laws. And one story that we might be able to tell is the mass lynching that took place of Chinese in the I think in the 1870s. I don't know the exact year, but there was a mass lynching that took place in the Los Angeles area. And that certainly is a nexus between the African-American community and the Chinese community, a story that we could tell. And then I had a couple of ideas around health-related issues, just to kind of show commonality between the two groups, and one being the impact that COVID had on the AAPI community, which was, as devastating as it was to the Black community. And yet I think we each kind of report in our silos, and maybe to do some type of cross-reporting around that issue.
Yes,
might be useful.
That's very, Cheryl Brown and a number of us were on a conference call she helped organize of caregivers, family caregivers, and they were African-American. And one of them, Cheryl, do you want to mention the idea that came out of that roundtable, where they called for wanting to talk to Asian family caregivers about how to get younger family members more involved in care of elders?
Yeah, one of the things that we found is that the Asian community still has that family connection where they take care of their elders. And it's a big concern, because as we age, we don't have enough people to take care of those aging folks that are. So at USC, their School of Gerontology is full of Asian students from China. Many of them are from China. And they said what they told me was that when they go home, they've got to take care of their mother. They've got to take care of their grandparents. So I think that we could form some kind of something that we talk about the importance of being caregivers for our seniors, our older adults.
And let me just say, Stephanie, you did a remarkable story in the Black Voice News on the history of the segregated beaches in Southern California. And I remember the photographs. I would disagree slightly with Rong Xiaoqing on the power of historical images to tell stories, because I still remember the photographs you had in Black Voice News about the segregated beaches, and the train that went to the one beach that was a Black-owned beach. I do think the storytelling of history for each of us about each other's communities can be very powerful.
Sandy, I want to add, I was just thinking about that. I was looking up Chinatowns in historic Chinatowns in the Inland Empire, which had quite a few.
Right.
And suffered some violence similar to Black communities in our region. And I thought about like mapping that, and similar to that concept of the segregation by the sea, where you see kind of historical images too. It is a powerful way of telling stories.
It is indeed. Thank you.
I'm sorry, there is a map, and if I find it, Sandy, I'll send it to you. There's a map that has, I mentioned those 200 plus Chinese towns and villages that used to exist in California.
Yes.
They're gone because they were taken out of existence.
Sandy, I have several comments I'd like to make.
Henrietta, go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. I'd like to follow up on several things that Helen said. One, she talked about having representatives from the Black community, for example, come out and talk about their collaborations with Asian Americans and also to decry the violence against Asian Americans. I'd like to see some profiles on the Asian Americans who are for affirmative action, or Asian Americans who come out and support the causes of civil rights, like Helen herself. Why not have a profile just in terms on Helen and other people she know who've been on the forefront the way she's been on the forefront?
These stories are not really well known at all in communities, because really so many of these leaders have been invisible. Henrietta, do you have another story idea?
Yes, I have another idea. The relationships between Blacks and Asians was certainly marred during the disturbances that took place over the beating of Rodney King and the disturbances that occurred in the aftermath of the decisions, exonerating the police officers involved. When we saw Koreans, for example, standing on their roofs with guns. And so I think in all honesty, incidents like that should be mentioned, because those are the ones that have helped put a bitter taste in some people's mouths. But I'd like to see, have there been any examples of healing between the two communities?
Right.
And I think Paula might be there. I mean, might know of this since she's in LA. And I think wherever there have been examples of rifts between the two groups, if we could also talk about the healings that have been involved. And one third idea, if I could.
Hold on. Why don't, Medras, could you put your idea in the chat so we don't lose it?
Sure I can.
Because we are running out of time and I don't want to lose your idea.
I sure can.
If I could just finish, Helen talked about the groups that have stirred up the dissension between Blacks and Asians. I'd like to see something on those think tanks themselves, if there's evidence of that, and what can be said to bring out what groups like this are doing and the effects that they're having.
Great. We have very limited time. We have 5 minutes left. Julian and Tanu both have their hands up, and then Shania and Yuji and Diana, and Randall, we're so grateful that you're part of this conversation. Please feel free to put your story ideas in the chat, because I may not have a chance to call on you, and we would love to have whatever ideas you have part of this larger conversation. So Julian and then Tanu, and then we probably have to end the call.
Thank you, Sandy. Just along the lines of the previous speakers talking about ideas between communities for inter-ethnic relations. I remember the Asian store operating in Black neighborhoods tend to be flashpoints But I remember some years ago, I visited this market operated by a Korean store owner. It's actually owned by a young Korean. And he was actually, daytime, he run the store, but he's actually a musician at heart. And on the weekend, he would get together with other hip hop artists in the Black communities to organize DJ nights and just promoting the music. And so that is one example of how communities, stories, people coming together and find commonalities. And then I was also struck by some years ago when I visited the Brown families, San Bernardino, and Paulette introduced me to some of the Asian interns that the Black New Voice used to host. And I thought it was extraordinary, giving Asian students an opportunities for learning about journalism, and at the same time, learning about the Black community in San Bernardino and covering stories about the Black communities in San Bernardino. So I'm just wondering, that might be can be like a follow-up as to these students after many years, what have they been done seen, and whether the Black Voice News is still hosting these Asian students.
Great
So
idea.
just to those.
Great ideas. Thank you. Tanu, do you want to be our last speaker before I close this out?
Yeah, I can piggyback off everybody else's ideas. But yeah, just a couple of things came to mind. One is, sort of building on what Mrs. Brown talked about earlier about healthcare and caring. I think I was looking at the statistics at Charles Drew University in Los Angeles. Black students make up about 36%. Asian students make up about 24%, and then everybody else, I think Latinos are about 21%. So I think just looking at sort of the public health care realm and do a story on students at Charles Drew and how they are involved in community care, because it's a school that's dedicated to helping people in the immediate Los Angeles community. So looking at that and how Black students and Asian students work together, medical doctors as public health professionals. And then another story that kind of crossed my mind is like businesses. I know one place you see a lot of cross-cultural sharing is sort of in the hip hop, sneaker, skateboard culture.
Right.
Kind of look at the sort of DJs and the sneaker collection. There are a lot of streetwear designers that are Asian, a lot of streetwear designers that are Black, and there's this sort of.
Those are great ideas too.
That's a good story idea.
Yeah, I think Malcolm certainly lit up that. That is, look,
true.
all of you are, I'm so appreciative. California Black Media, Ethnic Media Services want to just thank you all for joining this call, and thank Paula and Helen for sharing your personal stories, because this, I think in a way, the most powerful stories are the personal stories. So
Sandy, can you give me 1 minute?
Sure. Of
Yeah,
course.
I promise, 1 minute. Obviously, the Chinese Black solidarity stories, anything about blended families, that'll always work. And as I'm listening to everyone else, I don't know exactly the story idea, but obviously there's racial lines, but I still always see stories about, I just see something about vulnerable elders living in the world, living in the community, and how elders just aren't sacred across the board. When I was talking about this with Regina, it's like every group has a grandmother. Everyone understands grandma, right? And so that should be able to transcend. So if we could tell some story through the eyes of an elderly woman, leaving her home and navigating throughout the world, someone and all the things they come into encounter with, just somehow to humanize, grandmothers from one group to another, because it just seems like everyone usually grandma is sacred, right? In your own community. So
Yeah.
why wouldn't another grandmother be sacred too?
Great.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Look, this is an experiment. I am again deeply grateful to all of you for joining today's call. If you didn't get called on, I will be calling you after the conference and in the 1 or 2 days ahead to check in with you on story ideas. We want very much all of you to produce a story, to join this fellowship, and to share the content. Let's agree, we all want, nothing makes an editor happier than story ideas, and then the possibility of being able to share content. So this is a first step and very inspiring. And thank you, Helen. Thank you, Paula, so much for kicking us off with this. It's a tricky subject. It is in many ways a taboo subject. People are afraid of saying the wrong thing, of stepping on toes, of all sorts of tripwires as we become more polarized and divisive. And that's why both Regina and I and all of us, so many of us who work together, Paulette and Charles, and I mean, Malcolm, all of you, Diana, all of us want to see a way we can tell stories that heal, as Medras said. If we can capture examples and share them with each other. This is a small step, but it could be historic, and we could do more and build on this. So thank you all. I hate to leave. This is why I'm in this whole enterprise and rarely get the pleasure of actually brainstorming together. So thank you all. And I'll call on everyone who didn't have a chance to speak. Julian, would you do me a favor, or Alexis, and just make sure the chat box that we save, that we copy it? I'm afraid I'll lose ideas, and I want to make sure we've captured everybody's comments.
And Sandy, my little last note, I know we've been over 5 minutes. I'm gonna shut up because I know Sandy is a stickler for living on time. But Malcolm, I just want you to know, when we saw that the horrific thing about the elders, it's the first thing that I said. So I truly would love to see a story about the elders. When we saw the Black guy knocking the elder down, I thought to myself, if I was there, I would have beat him down. Like, in a Black community, you don't do that. So I just want every journalist on here to know that's not Black. In the Black community, we don't get down like that. That's just like I would call Paula, Miss Madison. It's because our parents taught us better. And so therefore, I want you to know that that's not, like, as Al Sharpton said, that is not representative of our community. And in any community, somebody like that would get beat up. I know this is being taped, but they would get beat down.
You're supposed to get beat up for doing something like that. Shit.
You do something like that, and I'm surprised that the people in our community did not go track them fools down and beat them down, because you just don't do that. You just don't do that to a senior or kids. You don't do it.
By the way, I brought Al Sharpton to Chinatown to meet with Reverend Bayer Lee of the First Chinese Baptist Church, is the name of it, on Mott Street, after Akai Gurley was killed by police officer Peter Liang and New York was coming apart. I bring that up because there's so much that we don't know that goes on behind the scenes. And as a former working journalist, I used to run the news department for NBC4 in New York. As former working journalists, sometimes what we're able to do is bring people together at an invitation. So if we were to do certain kinds of stories where we gathered people and ask them to have a conversation with us, and they're of different races, so many things could change, because the role of a journalist is not merely to record and report what's happening. Sometimes you actually can put the elements together, and like magic, an amazing outcome can occur. So I just like to put that in your heads.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. I hate leaving, actually, because I have a feeling everybody on this call has more valuable insights to share. But I also fear if there's a call out for another conference call, it'll be more time than I can commit. So I want to make sure everyone knows we try to keep to the timetable and are aware of the enormous value of your time. Okay, over and out, and until we meet again. Okay. Could somebody make sure to get the chat room stuff copied?
Yes, Sandy, it will all be copied and I'll send it to you.
Terrific.
And I copied it on my own, Sandy. This
All
was
right.
a rich conversation. And Henrietta, Regina will be back in touch with you.
Okay.
Is she
All
there
right.
still?